The first time Julian LaRue saw her, she wasn't doing anything extraordinary. She was standing in front of a small Haitian cafe tucked between the glass towers of downtown Miami, one hand shielding her eyes from the golden sun, the other holding a worn paperback. Her hair was pinned in a soft bun that danced in the breeze, and the soft lilac of her dress seemed to glow in the heat. He didn't know her name. Not yet. But something about her stopped him mid-step on the sidewalk. Julian, the man who never stopped for anyone. The billionaire tech mogul whose name carried weight in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Shanghai, who'd graced the cover of Forbes 3 times before his 35th birthday, who'd built an empire with the ruthlessness of a man who'd grown up with nothing and vowed never to return to that place again. And yet, for the first time in years, he found himself stuck, watching, not because she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, though she was beautiful in a quiet, unbothered way, but because she radiated something he couldn't name, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Elegance. Not the kind you buy with designer labels or display at galas with champagne glasses in hand. No, this was an elegance born of presence, of stillness, of grace under an invisible pressure. She wasn't performing. She simply existed, and that was enough to make the world tilt. Julian didn't speak to her that day. He watched as she stepped inside the cafe, the bell above the door chiming softly behind her. He could have followed her. He could have introduced himself. He could have done a dozen things a man like him was used to doing when he wanted something. But he didn't. Instead, he returned to his penthouse overlooking the water, poured himself a glass of 18-year-old scotch, and tried, unsuccessfully, to forget the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled at the elderly man holding the door for her. Her smile had lived in his mind for days, until fate, or maybe something deeper, intervened. It was a Wednesday. Julian hated Wednesdays. They always felt like the middle of a sentence, unfinished, impatient, waiting for something to resolve. His assistant had double-booked him for a speaking engagement at university downtown, and instead of canceling, Julian had chosen to walk the surrounding streets during the break. Maybe he needed air, or maybe he was hoping for the impossible. And then, there she was again. Same cafe, same soft glow about her. This time, she was seated at a small table beneath the awning, a cup of coffee beside her, eyes cast downward to her book. Julian didn't hesitate. He approached, heart beating louder than it had in years. "Excuse me," he said, his voice lower than he intended. She looked up, her eyes locking with his. Deep brown, steady, kind. Yes. He froze. For a man who delivered keynote addresses to thousands and pitched billion-dollar ideas in shark-infested rooms, he found himself completely tongue-tied. I saw you here last week," he admitted. "You were reading. I didn't say anything then, but I wanted to." Something shifted in her gaze. Not alarm, not curiosity, just quiet amusement. "That's a long delay between intentions," she said, setting her book down. "But go on." He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "My name's Julian." She smiled. "I know who you are." Of course she did. He was recognizable, even in a simple linen shirt and rolled-up sleeves. "And you are?" he asked. "Naomi." She didn't offer a last name. Somehow he knew not to ask. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Julian had ever known. He began coming to the cafe under the guise of needing a break from meetings or a quiet place to think, but the truth was always Naomi. She became his quiet place, not just a distraction, but a revelation. She wasn't impressed by his money. In fact, she barely acknowledged it. She worked at the Paris Art Museum, curating exhibits with the kind of thoughtfulness that made people weep in front of sculptures. Her passion for art and history ran deeper than anything he could fake his way through, and she wasn't afraid to call him out when he tried. "You keep trying to impress me with who you are," she said once, stirring sugar into her espresso. "But I'm more interested in who you've been." He had never told anyone about his father's overdose, about the food stamps, About the 6 people sharing one mattress in Liberty City before his app went viral and changed everything. But he told Naomi, late one night, on her rooftop, with a breeze heavy with salt and the scent of night-blooming jasmine, he let it spill. And she listened, not with pity, but with reverence. "I think," she said softly, "that's where your elegance comes from too." He had never thought of himself as elegant. Powerful, yes. Strategic always. But elegant? Naomi saw things in him he had long buried under success. And the deeper they fell, because they were falling, unquestionably, Julian found himself rewriting the rules he'd built his empire on. One evening, as they walked along the shoreline behind her apartment, the city lights behind them and the waves like whispers beneath their feet, Julian stopped suddenly. "I want to give you the world," he said. Naomi smiled gently. "I don't want the world, Julian. I want you." And in that moment, the billionaire who had everything realized just how little he'd had before her. That night, they didn't return to the city. They stayed on the beach until sunrise, wrapped in a silence that said more than words ever could. Julian held Naomi close, her head resting against his chest, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to be anywhere else. Not in a boardroom, not on a plane, just here, with her. The days grew longer, softer. Naomi introduced him to a version of Miami he never knew existed. Away from luxury yachts and neon parties, there were poetry readings in hidden courtyards, hole-in-the-wall jazz clubs where the saxophone wept stories older than the city itself, farmers markets brimming with fruit whose names he couldn't pronounce, but whose taste lingered on his tongue for days. And Julian, he introduced her to stillness, to sunrises on the balcony of his penthouse, where she'd sketch the skyline while he made coffee, to moments of vulnerability, like showing her the folder on his laptop labeled failure, filled with ideas that never took off. She called it his humility archive and kissed him on the forehead. Their worlds collided with surprising ease. His staff adored her. His mother, who hadn't smiled since Julian's father passed, laughed like a young girl when Naomi visited for dinner. Naomi's sister, protective to the bone, grilled Julian for 2 hours straight before hugging him and whispering, "Don't mess this up. She's been hurt enough." But love, even the deepest kind, isn't always enough to keep the storm away. And the storm came on a Tuesday. Julian's company was set to go public. The IPO was going to be historic. But a former partner, a man Julian had trusted, leaked private emails to the press. Emails that painted Julian as cold, ruthless, calculating. Not illegal, but deeply damaging. And in the media frenzy that followed, Naomi was pulled into the fire. Photographers staked out her apartment. Online tabloids published headlines like, "Mystery Woman Tames Miami's Coldest Billionaire." And who is she? Naomi M. exposed. She lost 2 museum partnerships. An exhibit she curated was postponed indefinitely. "I didn't sign up for this," she said one night, her voice shaking, not with anger but fatigue. "I knew you were powerful, but I didn't know loving you would mean giving up parts of my life." Julian didn't know what to say. He wanted to fix it. He always fixed things. But this wasn't a bug in an app. This was her life, her reputation, her peace. So he did the only thing that made sense in that moment. He left, not out of cowardice, but love. He thought that by walking away, he'd be giving her a chance to rebuild, to reclaim the silence she loved. The cafe stopped feeling warm. The penthouse felt like a prison. He stopped checking the news, stopped taking meetings. He poured himself into fixing the damage the scandal had caused, not for his shareholders, but for her. And she went quiet. 3 months passed, until one evening, he received an envelope. No name, no return address, just his name written in Naomi's handwriting. Inside, a plane ticket, one way, to Haiti, and a note. "If you're still the man who sees beauty in stillness, come find me." The plane landed in Port-au-Prince just after sunset. The air was heavier here, but the weight felt ancient, sacred. He hired a driver, followed directions that took him far from the city, up winding mountain roads, through villages where children played barefoot and old women braided hair beneath banyan trees. Finally, they arrived at a small house built into a hillside, with white shutters and bougainvillea climbing its walls. Naomi stood in the doorway, barefoot, no makeup, hair wrapped in a silk scarf, and yet she never looked more radiant. "You came," she whispered. "I never left," he replied. She stepped forward and placed a hand over his heart. "Then why did this feel so empty without you?" They didn't speak for a while. There was no need. He spent the next month there. No internet, no stock alerts, just long walks, mangoes fresh off the tree, and hours spent talking about things that didn't require money to be meaningful. He met her grandmother, who taught him how to dance in the kitchen. He learned how to breathe again. When they returned to Miami, they did so differently. Julian stepped down as CEO, not out of disgrace, but peace. He launched a nonprofit in Naomi's name, supporting artists from underserved communities across the Caribbean and Latin America. The board fought him on it. He didn't care. Naomi returned to the museum, but this time on her terms. She led an exhibit titled Stillness in Motion, an exploration of elegance, presence, and the unseen battles we carry. Julian stood in the back row at the opening night, watching as she spoke, surrounded by sculptures and paintings that whispered truths he'd only just learned to hear. Later that night, he proposed, not with a diamond the size of a marble, but with a simple silver band inscribed with 5 words. "You are my quiet place." She said yes with tears in her eyes. They married under the banyan trees of Haiti, barefoot and laughing, while children threw flower petals and old women hummed lullabies. No media, no press releases, just love. Sometimes, people ask Julian what changed him. He never gives the full answer. Because how do you explain that the man who had everything never truly lived until he met a woman reading a book outside a cafe? How do you explain that elegance isn't found in riches, but in resilience, in presence? In a woman named Naomi, who taught a billionaire that stillness is where the real power lives. Sometimes, people ask Julian what changed him. He never gives the full answer. Because how do you explain that the man who had everything never truly lived until he met a woman reading a book outside a cafe? How do you explain that elegance isn't found in riches, but in resilience, in presence? In a woman named Naomi, who taught a billionaire that stillness is where the real power lives. Now, every morning, Julian wakes before dawn, not to check stock tickers, but to make her tea the way she loves it, with honey and a whisper of lemon. And every evening, they walk hand in hand through the streets of a city that once felt like a battlefield, but now feels like home. He still owns buildings, but it's the life they built together that he treasures most. A quiet, extraordinary love story that Miami will never forget. Because in a world obsessed with flash, they chose depth. And in a city fueled by speed, they found grace and stillness. Together.